Okay, Erev Tov, everybody, welcome. It's a pleasure to welcome Rabbi Gedalyah Berger to make his inaugural appearance on Torah in Motion Zoom channel. A pleasure to meet you. I've heard, of course, a lot about you. Rabbi Berger teaches in GPATS, the graduate program in advanced Talmud study at Stern College for Women, and he also teaches in the Yoatzot Halakha program. He served as a rabbi for 15 years, I believe, in Mount Vernon, New York, and is a Wexner Fellow, a student of Rav Aaron Lichtenstein with a degree in physics. So it's a pleasure to welcome Rabbi Berger for the Parshat Shavua. Vakasha.
Okay, thank you very much. It's an honor to be invited. Thank you, Rabbi Kelman, for having me here. It's actually, you mentioned that I used to be a rabbi of a shul. I haven't been now for several years, and most of my career involves teaching halacha. It's a special pleasure to have the opportunity to have been invited to give a parsha shiur, which is something that I haven't done in quite a long time. So it's personally a pleasure and an opportunity for me to do something a little bit different from what I usually do. I also want to mention also that I have a particular pleasure of having Rabbi Kelman's daughter Atara as a student now in two different programs, and I thank you for that too. Okay, so I've been asked to give a shiur here for Parshat Vayetzei, and I don't know if the title was ever made it through or was announced, but the title that I gave for this shiur is, what do you call it? Yaakov's covert career. And what I want to be exploring with you is something that seems to have remained hidden in a story which tends to be very, very familiar to us. The story of Yaakov Avinu, which occupies much of the middle of Sefer Bereshis, a story with which a lot of us are very familiar in general. And there's something going on during the course of Yaakov's life that doesn't really get noticed. Now, I call it covert, kind of as if it's hidden, but it's not. It's really hidden in plain sight. What we're going to be looking at carefully this evening are very, very, very simple psukim that form part of the core of the story, but which we usually tend to look at as almost like filler material and not part of the main thread, and which I think have something profound to teach us about Yaakov Avinu and something else that was going on in his life while everything else was going on. Let's begin with a relatively quick review of what we would normally think of as the regular biography of Yaakov Avinu, the main central points, main central episodes that happen in the story of Yaakov Avinu. And I think everybody has access to the source booklet. There it is. It's in the chat. But of course, I'm putting it on the screen here. What we're going to go through here, just a quick review of the sequence of Yaakov Avinu's life. And here we're going to be looking at Toldos, Vayetzei, and Vayishlach. We're going to stop before the second half of Yaakov's life, when Yosef and his story begins to take center stage. We're going to be looking at the part of the story where Yaakov is really the almost the only central character. So Parshas Toldos, Perek Chafei, chapter 25, begins with the birth of Yaakov, who is of course a twin, together with his brother Esav, followed by despite Esav having been the Bechor, having been the firstborn, Yaakov buys in a kind of sudden move when Esav is in a moment of weakness. Yaakov buys the rights of the firstborn from Esav in exchange for some food that Esav wanted when he was exhausted. The next major story is later on in their lives, when Yitzchak is about to die and he wants to give the bracha, the blessing, to his son Esav, and Yaakov tricks Yitzchak into giving the bracha to him on the advice of his mother Rivka. And when Esav gets so furious that he whispers that he plans to kill him later on, Yaakov flees Eretz Canaan to his uncle Lavan's home in Haran in order to save himself. On the way, we now move into Parshas Vayetzei, this week's parsha. On the way to Haran, he dreams of the angels on a ladder going up and down, and Hashem, for the first time, appears to him and gives him a bracha for the future, the bracha that was very familiar to us throughout Sefer Bereshis, of the promises for the future that had been promised to Avram Avinu and now are being passed on to Yaakov as well. What ensues then in Parshas Vayetzei after Yaakov arrives in Lavan's house is that he wants to marry Rachel. He works for 7 years so that in order to earn the right to marry Rachel. But after the 7 years of work, Lavan tricks him and gives him Rachel's older sister Leah instead. And then after he marries Leah, he then insists on marrying Rachel too, which he does a week later in exchange for staying on for another 7 years of work after that. And now that Yaakov has married his 2 wives, there's then an extended sequence in Parshas Vayetzei that describes the birth of many of his children. He bears his wives together with the Bilhah and Zilpah, the maidens that were brought into the family as well, bears a daughter and 11 sons. And then the rest of Parshas Vayetzei describes the end game of Yaakov's stay with Lavan, in which he becomes rich through the agreement about the different kinds of sheep with Lavan, and then finally at the end, he takes his family and flees Lavan's home to return to Canaan, and then along the way, after Lavan chases after them, they have an interaction, and then he makes his way back to Eretz Canaan. And at that point, we reach the beginning of Parshas Vayishlach, where Yaakov, now nearing Canaan at the end of that trip, prepares in various ways for his confrontation with Esav. He has that rather surprising confrontation, the way it works out, but at the end, they end up parting peacefully, each to their own part of the area. And in the midst of all of that, while that was going on, Yaakov has that mysterious fight with an angel, and wins that fight. And now that Yaakov his family have moved to Eretz Canaan, they find a place to live, which is near Shechem. And then the terrible story of the rape of Dinah occurs, and the unfortunate reaction of Shimon and Levi, and accompanied by the other brothers, and their killing of the people of Shechem in revenge for the raping of Dinah. And as we reach the conclusion of this summary, in the waning parts of Parshas Vayishlach, Hashem changes Yaakov's name to Yisrael, and he gives him the bracha again. And then, unfortunately, Rachel dies in childbirth as she gives birth to Binyamin, and Yaakov buries Rachel. So I just spent, I don't know what that was, 4 minutes, reviewing something which, like I said, is probably very familiar to a lot of us. This is the bread and butter of Sefer Bereshis, and anyone who would have been asked to give a brief biography of Yaakov Avinu, so this is what the biography would have consisted of. These are the main events during the course of Yaakov's life. But what I want us to learn together is something else that was going on the entire time, little bits. As each one of these events was happening, there was something else that was developing during the course of Yaakov's life. And what we're going to be doing, this is a rather lengthy source booklet in the sense that there are a lot of pages. Almost all of them are simply pages of the Chumash, of Sefer Bereshis, that we're going to be going through. But we're not going to be going through them in their entirety. We're going to be looking at these little data points along the way that tell this other story. Before I move into this, I just want to point out, for those of you for whom it might be easier to be following along in English, I don't know how many of you have this printed out, or if you simply want to download it and scroll down. But the last 2 pages, I'll scroll all the way down. Now, the last 2 pages of the booklet consist of translations of the psukim that we're going to be looking at. So when I put the chapter numbers there, if you want, instead of following along with the original text that I'm going to be scrolling through on the screen, you can follow along with the English instead, if that is easier for you. We begin in the middle of this week's Parsha on Parshas Vayetzei, and we will immediately encounter the theme that we're going to be developing, which is that at that point in the story, when Yaakov is at the threshold of adulthood, and he has just left his parents' house, having run away from his dangerous brother Esav, and he has that vision, that dream of the angels going up and down. So a little thing happens at the end of that story. After Yaakov recognizes that this is a holy place, he said to himself, "Ein zaki im beis Elokim v'zeh shar hashamayim." This is a very special place. It's the house of God. It's the gates of heaven. But he doesn't just leave it at that. After he wakes up in the morning with this recognition settling on him, before he leaves, he does something else. Vayikra es shem hamakom hahu beis el. Yaakov decides that he's going to give a name to this location. This location is special. It deserves a name. And he called it Baydale. Ve'ulam, though Luz Shem Ha'ir LaRishona, right? This was a place that had a name. It's interesting that when you read the story originally, the first read through, you don't really get the sense that this was a city at all, right? You get the sense of Yaakov lying down kind of in the middle of nowhere. And yet we discover near the end of the story that in fact he was in a city, or perhaps at the outskirts of a city, the name of which was Luz. And he decides that he's going to give it a new moniker, a new name, Beit El, the house of God, the house of Hashem. Now, the theme that we're going to be looking at through the course of this foray into Sefer Bereshis is this phenomenon, is the phenomenon of Yaakov as somebody who names things. And what we're going to be looking at is all of the different things that Yaakov decided to name, as well as the things that he decided not to name, and try to understand a very strange pattern that develops that seems to reflect something likely important about Yaakov, either Yaakov's personality or Yaakov's mindset or mode of thinking. And something possesses Yaakov here to name the place. Now, it's worth, by the way, taking a moment to consider, we usually read this and we just accept it. So Yaakov named the place. But what does that even mean? I mean, there was a city there already, right? Its name was Luz. It apparently had been there for a while. There was a whole big population there in the city. Yaakov was a random person happening to be passing through. He slept on the ground outside. He woke up in the morning, and then he left. So, what does it mean that he renamed the city? Did he march into the city gates and insist that the city council pass a resolution to change the name of the city? It kind of sounds like he just stood up and said, "I hereby declare this to be Baydale," or maybe he put a like they did like with the flag on the moon. Maybe he put a sign there that this is Baydale. But somehow Yaakov, despite the fact that this was probably what seems like on the face of it a kind of pointless endeavor, that this passerby is going to give a new name to the city, he decides to do it anyway, right? And somehow he thought that this is something that could have significance and was meaningful, and that obviously it raises a question of why he thought that was meaningful and in what way it was going to be. Okay, we move a little bit further on. I did skip some pages here that we didn't, where there was nothing really to look at. We now have moved into the story of him working to earn the right to marry Rachel, the marriage with Leah, and then followed by the marriage with Rachel. And then we encounter the stretch of psukim in which Yaakov's children are born. Children are born to his two wives and to the two shvachos, the two maidens. And each one of these children is named. And a reason is given for the name of each child. Now, by and large, we aren't going to be looking carefully at the reasons for the names, but we're going to be looking at the naming itself rather than the reason. So what happens here? Vatahar Leah vatelebein. Leah became pregnant and bore a son. Vatikra shemo Reuven, and she named him Reuven. Why? Ki amra, because she said XYZ. Okay, I'm not so interested in what that was. She said something about the birth of Reuven, and that expression that she made upon the birth of Reuven, that statement she made, generated the name Reuven. And she had another son, Vatomer, and again, she said something about the birth of this child, and Vatikra Shemo Shimon, and she named him Shimon. What do we see happening here so far? Anybody take notice yet of the pattern that we're seeing?
She's naming the children.
Exactly, right? Who is naming the children? Leah is naming the children, not Yaakov. Both the motivation for the name and the decision about the name has been made entirely by Leah, by the child's mother. We encountered at least once so far that Yaakov found it of great significance to name a place where something special happened, even though it's hard to imagine why he thought that name would necessarily stick, right? And here, his own children are being born, and he doesn't seem to care about the naming of his own children. He lets his wives name the children, and he doesn't participate. Now, the next child is a little bit interesting. The next child says, Vatomer, Leah said something, but what then happens at the end of the pasuk? Al kain kara shemo Levi. If your Hebrew grammar is good enough, then what does that line mean? It means, therefore, he called his name Levi. He named him Levi. So there's something strange going on here, that while the statement that leads to the name is something that Leah said, the naming does seem to have been done by Yaakov. But as we're going to see, it's going to be very important and necessary to consider this pasuk in light of what happens next. So let's keep going, and at a certain point later, we're going to come back to that pasuk. We move ahead to the next pasuk. Again, she had another son, Vatomer, and she said, and then Al kain kara shemo Yehuda, right? So if you compare these two psukim, you see the difference, that here, this is in the feminine rather than the masculine. So now Leah again is the one who is naming Yehuda. Let's continue on further. Rachel then decides, because she sees that Leah is having so many children and she is still barren, and she asks Yaakov to take Bilhah as a wife as well, and to bear children through her. And in fact, Bilhah has a child, Vatomer Rachel, and Rachel said something, Al kain kara shemo Dan. And again, therefore, because of that statement that she made, she named him Dan. So now again, Rachel is the one who is naming the child, not Yaakov. And again, the next one, Vatomer Rachel said something, Vatikra shemo Naphtali, and she named him Naphtali. The next child is a child of Leah again, Vatomer Leah, Vatikra shemo Gad. Leah names the son. Vatomer Leah, Vatikra shemo Asher. Leah names Asher. And then those were the children of Zilpah. And then Leah has her own two more children, Vatomer Leah, Vatikra shemo Yisachar, and Vatomer Leah, Vatikra shemo Zevulun. Every single time Leah is naming the child because of some thought that came to her mind that she expressed upon the birth of the child. And then finally, for Leah, she has a daughter, Vatikra es Shema Dina, that Leah names her daughter Dina as well. And then for the final child in this round, this central part of Parshas Vayetzei, is finally Rachel gives birth to a child. And again, Vatomer, she speaks, Vatikra es Shemo Yosef Lemor, and she calls him Yosef, saying something else. That's one of the interesting aspects of the naming of Yosef, is that there are actually two different two different statements of Rachel that contribute to the naming of Yosef, Asaf Elokim Escher Pasi, and then Yosef Hashem Libein Acher. But again, that's not our topic, the substance behind the names. What we're interested in, simply as you can see, is taking a look at who is the person who's doing the name. And so when we look at this sequence of events as a whole, so we get the very, very obvious impression that Yaakov did not take an active interest in the naming of his children. That Yaakov's wives were the ones who named the children. And once you see that about all of them, you then recognize, when you see it in context, that the naming of Levi, where it did say Al Kain Kara Shemo Levi, it said it in the masculine, implying that Yaakov was the one who was naming him,
we can't see you.
I'm sorry?
We can't see you.
Yeah, sure we can. I mean, that's probably your camera. Yeah. I see. We see you fine.
Okay.
Debbie, just sort of move your on top where it's coming from, or put it on speaker view.
Okay. Yeah, if you put it on speaker view instead of gallery, so that works better. Where was I? Yes. So once you see this in context of the entire story, it becomes very obvious that the pasuk, the Torah's description of the naming of Levi, is an aberration, right? We have 12 children being born here, 11 sons and 1 daughter. In every single case, it's the mother that names the child. It's the mother's statement that results in the name of the child. And then we have this one seemingly strange exception where, even though Leah was the one who said whatever it was that was the basis of the name, it seems that Yaakov was the one who actually named him. Now, this, of course, did not go unnoticed by Chazal and by the Mefarshim on the Chumash, and the different commentators take, not surprisingly, 2 different tacks in explaining this. There's one group, the Radak and the Rashbam and some others, that take the meaning of the grammar of the pasuk on its face and understand that, in fact, it was Yaakov, the simple meaning of the pasuk, that Yaakov was the one who named Levi. And then they tried, at least some of them try to explain, what was unusual about this particular child or this particular circumstance that motivated Yaakov, which was to do something that was obviously out of character, that was something that he didn't usually have an interest or a proclivity to do. Then there's another school of writers that says that, in fact, the pasuk doesn't mean that Yaakov named Levi. Now, and obviously the motivation for those Mefarshim to say that it wasn't Yaakov is the fact that Yaakov didn't name any of his other children. And so even though it seems like it's saying that Yaakov named Levi, it must be that that's not true. It must be that Yaakov didn't name Levi, just like he didn't name any of the other children, and that this line, Al Kain Kara Shemo Levi, is really a reference to somebody else. Who's the somebody else? So there are, 2 Mefarshim that I can point to. One of them is Rabbeinu Bechaya, who actually says that it's Al Kain Kara Shemo Levi is a reference to Hashem, that God named Levi. Obviously, there's a certain almost midrashic poetry to that, in that Levi then becomes the father of the tribe that becomes the closest servants of God, and the idea that Hashem is the one who named Levi is an interesting twist. Rashi on this pasuk quotes a medrash that is so troubled by this seemingly strange notion that Yaakov named Levi that the medrash says that Levi was in fact named by an angel, that the Malach Gavriel came and named Levi, again for one reason or another. we have, generally speaking, two possibilities here. Either Yaakov didn't, in fact, name Levi, or he did, but if he did, it's clearly an aberration, and there must have been some reason for it. Let me take one moment to, one of the reasons that's given has to do with some idea that Yaakov, with some sort of prophecy about the significance of Levi, and so that's why he got involved, whereas it wasn't significant to him with his other children. One other possibility, which strikes me, as to why, if in fact this really was Yaakov, as to what might have motivated him here, is to actually look at what it is that Leah said that motivated this name, right? If you compare it to the earlier ones, right? The first Ruvain was named because Kira'ah Hashem be'ani ki ataya havani ishi, that Leah very kind of in an almost pitiful fashion says that she was always the second wife, the less loved wife, and she's praying that maybe Hashem will see my troubles and maybe my husband will love me now that I bore him a son. And she names him Reuven. And then the second one is that Hashem heard that I am hated, and he gave me this son, right? But she's referring to Hashem and his seeing and hearing her troubles. When the third child is born, she uses the following phrase: "Ata hapam." This time, Yilave ishi elai. Right? She doesn't address Hashem. She's just stating, this time my husband will yilave'ili, he will accompany me, he will become attached to me, right? In a more confident fashion. She's kind of almost directing this at him rather than to God, and with an expectation rather than being just kind of pitiful and prayerful, because I have borne him 3 sons. And perhaps Yaakov, hearing that expression from Leah, that this time my husband will actually join me, maybe that motivated him in that moment to join with his wife, that for that one time with Leah, and to participate in he acquiesced in participating in the naming of his son Levi. As far as I'm concerned, though, this is all a very, very important question about in the detailed meaning of this pasuk. But for the broader picture, which is what I'm more interested in terms of the trends in Yaakov's life, this pasuk is significant more in that it is the exception that proves the rule, than in it being, of great significance unto itself, right? The very fact that all of the Mefarshim are going on and on about this is just a further sign of the degree to which this is a very strange exception to the pattern. And so we can move ahead further through Sefer Bereshis, having rather well established the idea and the fact that Yaakov had virtually no interest in the naming of his children. Now, if we would stop here, then we wouldn't necessarily have anything of especially particular interest, right? What would we have? We would have established that Yaakov happened not to care that much about naming his children. And we had one episode before that where he did care about naming a location that he lived, which is a little strange, but okay, that does not create any, major pattern here. But that changes as we go forward. After Yaakov names his children, and then he stays in Lavan's house for a long time. And when the time comes at the end of Parshat Vayetzei, at the end of this week's Parshat Shavua, for Yaakov to when he decides to leave, so he leaves, he runs away, and then Lavan chases after Yaakov and the family. He's very upset that they snuck out in the middle of the night. And there's that whole interaction with Rachel sitting on the idols and so on. And at the end, they finally part with a kind of cold peace between the two of them. They make an agreement, a deal between the two of them about how they're going to handle their relationship of their families going forward. And in order to symbolize the deal, Yaakov, he arranges, they take a bunch of stones and they make a little pile as a pile of stones as a symbol of the agreement. What happens? Vayikra lo Lavan Yigar Sahadusa. And Lavan named this place, either the place or the thing. It sounds like he's naming the place. Yagar Sahadusa, right? One of the very, very unusual examples of an Aramaic phrase in the Torah. And so here Lavan decided to name a place. And then what happens? The Yaakov Karalo Gal'ed. That Yaakov, even though Lavan had already just named the place, Yaakov couldn't really abide that, right? Yaakov found it necessary to know, I'm going to give it my own name, right? Now, of course, what is his own name? Gal'ed, which means a pile of stones as a witness, which actually is exactly the same thing as Yagar Sahadusa. It's just in Hebrew instead of in Aramaic, right? So even though he wasn't even really changing the name, but it's almost like Yaakov couldn't bear to sit by while somebody else named the place, and he didn't get a chance at the action, right? So he had to, stick up for his own desires to give a name to the place. So here, Yaakov again, when something important happens, he decides to name the location. A little while later, when Yaakov is on his way back into Eretz Canaan, he once again has either a dream or something perhaps more substantial in which he encounters angels, just like he encountered the angels on the ladder on the way out of Eretz Canaan. He encounters angels again on the way into Eretz Canaan. It's many years later. Vayomer Yaakov kasher ra'am, and Yaakov said when he saw these angels, Machanei Elokim zeh, this is a encampment of God, just like the earlier place was the Beit Elokim, was the house of God. This is a camp of God. And what do you know? Vayikra shem hamakom hahu machanayim. And Yaakov once again names this place Machanayim because it's Machanei Elokim. So again, something interesting happens, and Yaakov decides to name the location. So here we finally do begin to see both a pattern and a puzzle developing about the attitude and the mindset of Yaakov Avinu. That Yaakov Avinu appears to have had a great interest in the naming of places, despite the fact that he had no interest whatsoever in the naming of his own children. And we're going to have to start thinking about why that might be and what that might reflect. But as we go further, we will see that this issue becomes more and more and more pronounced as time goes on. We then come to the story at the beginning of Parshas Vayishlach, when Yaakov ends up alone on the other side of the stream, and he encounters this mysterious man who turns out to be an angel, and he has that fight with him in which he injures his back. And after it's all over, Vayikra Yaakov Shem Hamakom Peniel, Ki Raisi Elohim Panim El Panim Vatinatzel Nafshi. Yaakov named the place Peniel because he saw God face to face, as it were, and he was saved. Peniel from the word panim. Okay, I don't have to belabor the point, but here we see it again. Once again, Yaakov feels before he leaves he has to name the place. Worth noting again, as we're going through here, that the naming of the place every time seems likely to be almost like a pointless exercise, right? That he's just passing through. What holding power are these names going to have on the place? But yet Yaakov decides to do so. You begin to see here what I was talking about at the beginning, that there's this other biography of Yaakov that we tend to miss when we're going through all of this, that through the course of the main events of Yaakov's life that were part of that summary biography that we gave at the beginning, sprinkled throughout along the way at many of the steps, there's this other thing that's happening, that Yaakov is naming all the places that he goes through, and it has its own layer of meaning throughout the rest of the main events of Yaakov's life. Later on, after he parts with Esav, the Yaakov nasa Sukkosav va'yiven lo bayis. He travels to Sukkot, and he builds a house. So it's the first place that he really settles down in Eretz Canaan. Ulemiknehu asa sukkos, and he made huts for his livestock, for his animals. Al kain, therefore, kara shem hamakom Sukkos. Now, he called the place Sukkos. Now, here we have something even stranger going on than what was going on the other times, right? So until now, Yaakov's propensity for naming places was that when something of striking significance happened, Yaakov decided that that place had earned a name, right? It was so significant that it was important to give it a name. The house of God, the encampment of God, the place where he made a deal with his uncle about making peace between the families, right? At least these were places that had significance of some sort. This place is just where he settled down. Okay, so you could say then that, you know, the place where he decided to settle in some seemingly somewhat permanent fashion, although we find out in the very next pasuk that he eventually moved again. So he decided, if this is where I'm going to be putting down roots, so then I'm going to give it a name. But what's really odd, right, is the name that he gave. What did the pasuk say? He built himself a house and his animals sukkos, and therefore he named it Sukkos, right? He named it after what he built for his animals, rather than what he built for himself. This almost comes across as like almost a parody of the idea of naming a place. Now we could perhaps try to sit and figure out, maybe there's some real significance here, and maybe there's some deeper meaning in why he chose the sukkos that he had built for his animals as the basis for the name of the place. But if you look at this as part of this larger pattern, it seems to be pointing to something about Yaakov now demonstrating that he really, really cared about giving names to places. It almost now is no longer about the significance of the place or the significance of the name even, right? But he couldn't let it go. He had to give a name to a place where he had been. The next step, Yaakov arrives in a new place in Shechem, and he buys a new plot of land. And what happens here? Vayetzei sham mizbeach. He set up an altar in this place. Vayikralo el Elohei Yisrael. Now what's happening? This time, Yaakov didn't even name the place. Now Yaakov has started to name altars. Okay, so he didn't name the whole area that he settled down in. Now he built a little thing, right? I don't know how big it was, this big, I don't know, and suddenly it needs a name as well, and a very prominent name too, with God's name twice in this name. This time, of course, it was an altar to Hashem, so that makes some sort of sense. So there's a real doubling down that's going on here, and this insistence on naming locations. In this case, not even a whole town, but just a very narrow location. Next, Yaakov returns to Baydale. That's a whole other very interesting story. Maybe I can give a Parsha Shir next year on Parshat Vayetzei. This is not Parshat Vayetzei anymore, it's Parshat Vayishlach. But the very interesting issue here of the fact that Yaakov only returned to Baydale after Hashem told him to, right? Despite the fact that when he was leaving Baydale the first time on the way in, he promised that he would come back, but he didn't. He didn't come back. He waited for Hashem to insist that he go back. But in any case, he arrives there finally. Vayavo Yaakov Luza Asher Be'eretz Canaan. He arrives in Luz, but the Torah makes a point of saying he Baydale, right? Well, let's remember that Yaakov had renamed Luz as Baydale. Vayiven Sham Mizbeach, and he built an altar there. Vayikra makom el Beit El. So he built a mizbeach, and now he called the place. Now, I don't know if the place sounds. It doesn't say he called the mizbeach this time. It says he called the makom, the place, el Beit El. Now it sounds like Yaakov is, before he said he was doubling down. Now he's tripling down. Now what's he doing? He's renaming a place that he himself had previously named. Right? He had already named this place, but now since he came back, before he leaves, he's got to name it again. And so he adds a word to the beginning of the name, and so now it's not Baydale anymore, it's El Baydale. And the very next pasuk, Vatamas Devora Meinekes Rivka, the nursemaid of his mother died. Vatikaver mitachat leBeydale tachat ha'alon, and she was buried below Baydale, which is on a hill, underneath an oak tree. Vayikra shemo alon bachus. And what did Yaakov just do? He named a tree. It doesn't say that he named the area. He named the tree, the oak of weeping or of tears, whatever you'd like to say, because this was a sad place. So, and not only is he naming a tree, he's naming a tree where who was buried. Obviously, I mean, I'm familiar with the medrash that it was really Rivka who had died now also, and not just Devorah, but the simple meaning of the pasuk is that the person who had died might have been an important person in some degree in his life, but it was basically a servant, right, who had died. And a servant died and was buried, and still Yaakov had to name not just the in a larger location, but he named the tree that she was buried on. He gave it a name. So this is really getting out of hand, right? That Yaakov, who never seems to have given any thought to the naming of his children, is going on and on and on with the naming of places and things, really places. Well, the only things that he has named are things that are attached to the ground, right? An altar, a tree, naming locations. Now, we're going to, in a moment, we're going to try to think about what was going on in Yaakov's mind and why was this meaningful to him. But actually, you know what? Let's do that now. Let's do that now. Why would somebody why would somebody not care all of that much about the name of people, but care a lot about the names of places? If you think about it, there's a rather obvious answer. Why is the name of a place of greater significance than the name of a person? Anybody have a thought?
It lasts longer.
Exactly, right? If I can successfully name a place, then that name of that place could be a permanent legacy. That's something just like, that's why we call it real estate, right? As opposed to other things, right? It's real estate because it's real, right? It's something that's permanent. It is the earth. It's not going anywhere. And so if I can successfully give a name to a place, then there's a good chance that that name and whatever meaning and message I feel is important in that name could last for generations and generations, and that people in the future could learn something from me, right, from the name of that place. People will forever know that this was the house of God, this place, that this was a place where somebody met God face to face, that this was the place where somebody was once crying because Devorah died, right? Of course, it might last for generations until somebody else like Yaakov comes along and decides to change it, right? But the point is that it's very lasting. As opposed to people are ephemeral. People don't last for very long. And if I name a person, so what's the big deal? So that's maybe the person's name for the person's life, but it isn't going to be something, it's not an imprint that I'm going to make on the world when I name a person. And I would suggest that that's likely what's going on in the mind and the heart and the thinking of Yaakov Avinu. That Yaakov really very much wanted to leave behind a lasting legacy for the future. He was a part of, obviously, a family that was insistent on and had been promised an important future. And part of that future was, of course, the land of Israel. And if you might notice, actually, that with only one exception, all of the places that Yaakov named were in either in or on the border of Eretz Yisrael, right? Machanayim is kind of sort of in Eretz Yisrael. It's on the other side of the Jordan. The only one that's not was Gal Eid, right? Was Yagar Sahadusa, which was further away. But Yaakov seems to think that giving a name to a place is something that will have last greatly into the future. But he didn't really care about the names of his children, right? That's a passing phenomenon, and so he let his wives name his children. That's likely what was motivating Yaakov, and he felt very, very attached to this idea that any time he passed through a place, he wanted to leave behind a stamp on it about something important that happened in his life. And it could have been, in fact, part of his vision for the future, that he knew that this land had been promised to his family so that, they would be around and that this could have lasting meaning. Okay. But the real kind of punchline to this whole pattern in Yaakov's life is that if we just go to the bottom of this same page, suddenly we discover something very strange. That after years and years and years of Yaakov very clearly reflecting the attitude that we've both identified and explained, something suddenly changes. A little while later, Yaakov is again in Baydale, and it says, "Vayikra Yaakov es shem hamakom asher diber ito sham Elokim Baydale." Now, when you read this pasuk just on its own, it sounds puzzling because it seems like it's duplicating. Like, what does it mean that Yaakov called that place Baydale? He already had named that place Baydale 20 years ago, right? Why does it suddenly say here that Yaakov's naming it Baydale? So what might the answer be, based on what we've learned so far? How could he be naming it Baydale now? What happened a few psukim ago? Yaakov, if we remember, had renamed Baydale a second time. It used to be Luz. 20-something years ago, he named it Baydale. And recently, because he had been there again, he named it a second time. He called it El Baydale. Now we find just a little while later, Yaakov is naming Baydale again, but this time, this seems to reflect not a deepening of Yaakov's attitude of insisting on naming places, but perhaps a reversal of Yaakov's interest in naming places. Because what he's doing now is he's reversing his renaming and putting back the old name that he had given it a long time ago. What then happens a few psukim later? Vayehi b'tzeis nafsha ki meisa, the tragic story of Rachel dies in childbirth. And what happens now for the final child of Yaakov? After all those 11 sons and one daughter before, that whole very extensive pattern that we developed before, that Yaakov never named any children, and even when he did, maybe he did, and it was after some impetus from Leah. What happens here? Vatikra shemo ben Oni. Rachel, as we would expect from the previous pattern, names her son. She names him Ben Oni. And now, out of nowhere, the Aviv Karalo Binyamin. Now, suddenly, not only is Yaakov, and notice how Torah emphasized Aviv, right? His father, the baby's father. Suddenly, Yaakov is a father who's interested in the names of his children. Not only does Yaakov, for the first time, name his child, and not only naming his child, but naming his child based on his own sense of meaning, right? Even if he did name Levi, it was because of something Leah said. This time, he's naming Binyamin, right? Benyamin, the son of the right, of strength. And not only does he do that, he's doing it even though this baby already had a name. Right? What Yaakov, until now, for his whole life, had only done for places, when his last child is born, now he's doing it for his child. When he never gave a name before, now he's insisting on giving a name, even though a name was already given. he has to be the one to name his son. Rachel's name is not good enough. I want my own name, my own meaning attached to the name of this child, just like he had done with when Lavan had named Yegarsa Hadusa and he insisted on calling it Gal-Eid, and just as with Luz, he insisted on giving it a new name, Baydale. Now he's giving his own name to his son. And then what happens next? Vayetzei Yaakov matzeva kvurasa. Rachel died, and then she was buried, right, the Bedera in Beit Lechem, and he built a monument over her grave. What is this starting to sound like? The story of Devora Meinekes Rivka, right? Just top of a few psukim earlier, Devora died and she was buried. And what did he do? He gave a name to the tree she was buried under. This time, what happens? Yaakov, not only is there a tree, he makes a point of building a matzeva, a monument over her grave. He matzeves kivuras Rachel ad hayom. That is the monument of what we now call Kever Rachel until today. What's absent? Yaakov never gives a name to the burial site of Rachel. It just remains until this very day in 2021. What's it called? Kever Rachel, right? The grave of Rachel. That's not a name. That's just a description. It's what it is. It's not a name. And the Torah never says that Yaakov named the place. And so in the space of 3 psukim here, we have a complete transformation, a total reversal of Yaakov's pattern of behavior and attitude that had existed throughout his life, in which he didn't name people and he only named places. And here he names his child, even though the child had already been previously named, and he resists naming what one could have imagined might have been the most significant place that Yaakov of all in Yaakov's experience, the burial place of his most beloved wife, who's with a relationship with whom had started this whole story, right? He had to name a tree when a servant died, but he doesn't name anything when Rachel died. Clearly, something about Yaakov and his attitude has changed. Now, obviously, when something like that changes, where do we look to find out why it changed? Well, obviously, where we have to look is over here, right? What happened in between? And wouldn't you know it, what happened in between is that somebody got a new name. Who got a new name? Yaakov himself, right? That's what happens at this glaring transition point in the life of Yaakov. Hashem appears to Yaakov and he says to him, Shimcha Yaakov, lo yikarei Shimcha od Yaakov. Your name will not be Yaakov anymore. Ki im Yisrael yeshmecha. Your name is going to be Yisrael. Vayikra Shemo Yisrael, right? And that's the type of phrase that we've seen throughout this whole, throughout this whole story is Vayikra Shemo. God names Yaakov Yisrael, and Hashem says to him, "Pray Revei, be fruitful and multiply. Goyu kahal goyim yihya mimeka. A great nation is going to come from you, and kings will come for you, and I'll give you the land of Israel." And Yaakov builds a matzeva, right, again. And now what does he do? He doesn't name the matzeva. He now reverses the name back to its old name of Baydale. The naming, Hashem's naming of Yaakov to the new name of Yisrael was a watershed moment for Yaakov's appreciation of what being the father of the future Am Yisrael meant. Yaakov had this attitude that if he wanted to leave a mark on the future, if he wanted to leave a lasting legacy that would not be ephemeral after a generation, he would have to leave his mark on a place, because the earth lasts forever and people don't. But the lesson that Hashem taught Yaakov is that I am giving you a new name. I'm giving you a new name. Why? Because you are going to have a future that is going to leave a legacy that will last for generations, that will last forever. Not because of places, but because of people. And in fact, it's the names of people that matter a lot more than places. It's what the people do that is going to have the lasting impact for generations and generations, for eternity throughout the future. I am calling you Yisrael, and I want you to be fruitful and multiply and have a nation that comes after you. And what happened? Yaakov began to understand that you can change the name of a place from one thing to another, and what happened here and what happened there, and it's a rock, right, or a tree. Okay, so it has a name, but who really cares, right? What matters and what's going to have a lasting impact is the actions of the people. And do you really think that those people are going to be just ephemeral and be lost to history? Well, and this is the kind of the icing on the cake, right? What actually ends up happening? What actually ends up happening is that the people are ephemeral, but the names are not, right? So what happened? Yaakov, Yisrael, he died a little while later, right? But what still lasts now, thousands and thousands of years later? The name Yisrael is still here today. Not only is the name Yisrael here, and the great, great irony, the biggest irony of all, is that after Yaakov named one place after another, right? This location is this location is that. What do we call the entire country? The entire land is called what? Eretz Yisrael, the land of Yisrael. In other words, the name of Yaakov. And the reason why that name has lasted all of these years, all these generations, is not because when you give a name to something, the name sticks. The name doesn't always stick. It's because of who Yaakov was and what he accomplished and what he taught his children and what they taught their children and the lessons and the meaning that and the message that they brought to the world, generation after generation after generation. That is the lasting legacy. And that is what took Yaakov until this midpoint of his life to understand something he was only able to understand after Hashem pointed it out to him by giving himself a new name. And we only have a couple of minutes left. I had wanted to do two more things as kind of like an appendix to this, but since I know we want some time for questions, I'm going to do one of them very quickly, and I'm going to leave out the other one. Okay, so just very quickly, a final thing, the interesting thing that happens. If you now skip, I said we were only doing the first half of Yaakov's life, but if you skip all the way to the end, the very, very end of Yaakov's life in Parshas Vayechi, when he's about to die, and he's giving a message to his children. So he asks for Yosef to come. Yosef decides to come visit him, and he starts giving a little speech to Yosef. And what does he say to him? Vayomer Yaakov el Yosef, El Shaddai nira elai beluz be'eretz Canaan vayevarach osi. At the very end of his life, in his dying days, what does Yaakov call that place? That first great place of significance in his life. The place where he saw the angels, the very first place that he ever named in the course of his life, it's back to being Luz, right? It's not Baydale anymore, because at this point in Yaakov's life, he doesn't care anymore what places are called. He cares what people are called, and that's actually reflected. I don't have really time to go into this, but in these psukim here, where he talks about the special place he's going to give Ephraim and Menashe as if they were his own children. He has this phrase, Al Shem Achehem Yikaru B'Nachal Asam, that they will take their portion in the future in the land of Israel with their brothers. You see here that the Nachala, now not only is Eretz Yisrael called Eretz Yisrael, but the sections of Eretz Yisrael are named how? They're named based on the names of Yaakov's children. Right, this is the section of Eretz Yisrael that's called Yehuda, and this is Ephraim, and that's Menashe, and that's Binyamin, and that's Dan. Right, the names of the people end up becoming the names of the places, because the names of the people are what's more lasting, rather than the names of places in a vacuum. Okay, the last piece here, which if you're interested, you can explore on your own, is to go all the way back to the beginning of Yaakov's life and think about, and this is something for food for thought, for pondering. There's a naming story when Yaakov was born, right? What about how he was originally named, right? That Yitzchak and Rivka named the first boy Esav and the second one Yaakov, and what were the reasons for those names, and the adding of the name of Edom Esav, there's a lot of interesting things there to explore that could potentially have bearing on Yaakov's psychology and how his attitudes perhaps had developed, but we don't have time to look into that. That's in any case a little bit less grounded in the psukim. It's a little more of interpretation, but I'll leave that for further food for thought. Okay, thank you very much. I enjoyed it. I hope that people found it valuable and interesting. Now, if is it too late for me to look at some questions?
No. You take a look at the questions. There are not so many, a few points, and then if anyone wants to speak up. But I just think you should give don't only focus on halacha. I think you should give Parshat Shavua a little bit more often. But that was really quite interesting. Really, and you're right. You don't notice that when you read the part. I mean, every point you said, yeah, of course, I know that pasuk, but it's very to see it all together. Okay, yeshikoach.
Okay, so a lot of what's here is comments rather than questions.
Right,
so
correct.
Somebody here made a comment that, in a certain sense, anticipated the whole end of the shir. So that's very nice. Okay, right. That there's significance to Machanayim and Baydale, right? About in Machlas Yisrael and on the two sides of the Jordan during the Nevi'im Rishonim. That's correct. All right, some compliments. Thank you. Okay. Okay. Interesting. So here's one question about a kind of question of contemporary applications, right? One of the people asked, does this lesson indicate a Jewish attitude to renaming places in our time in North America, re-indigenous peoples, right? So that's an interesting question, right? That's of course a very interesting, thing that as we drive on the highways and we see the names of places, and some of the places retain their Native American names. Some of the names around the New York area where I live retain their old Dutch names from when New York was a Dutch colony before the English took over, to some degree. I don't know if this teaches us a particular lesson. I think to me, actually, what it means, it's almost the reverse, right? It's not telling us what we should do. It highlights the fact. I mean, people name things all the time, name places all the time, right? The real question is which names stick, right? And the names that stick, ultimately the point is, are a reflection of the success of the people rather than vice versa. Right, and so it's almost like the opposite. What's the proportion? I'm speaking here from the United States. I know you are headquartered in Canada, but speaking from my environment. So what's the proportion of place names in the United States that are English as opposed to Dutch or French or Native American? So the answer is that the English kind of dominates, right? And that's a sign of the success. Now you could then, of course, raise all of the moral questions about, what was right and wrong about that history, but the history is the history. And that's true with what I'm saying about the course of Judaism through history also, is that the fact that these names are still around is in fact a reflection of the success of Judaism and of the message and impact of Yaakov and his descendants throughout the generations. Okay. Any other questions from the floor?
Anybody? Feel free to speak up. Okay. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you.
A pleasure. Okay. Say hello, please. Say hi to your father. Give him my regards.
Okay,
and okay. And I see Atara was on, so you can give her your regards yourself. You did. And thank you very much. And okay, tomorrow morning. I'm sorry.
I'm used to seeing Atara in a little square.
Yeah. Okay. Tomorrow morning, my shir on the siddur at 9:30. Next week, of course, we'll have actually an extra shir next week, all our regular shir, Rabbi Leaptag, beginning 11:15 on Sunday. But as I mentioned this morning, for those who weren't here, Rabbi Aaron Adler is going to be giving a 3-part series on the Rav on Hanukkah. He gave that before Rosh Hashanah. And on Pesach and Yom Kippur, he was, of course, a close student and a shamash of the Rav. He just published a book, 70 Conversations with the Ravs. So that'll be beginning Tuesday, 1 p.m. Eastern Time. I sent out an email earlier today for registration, then all our regular shiurim during the week. Next Thursday night, Joel Finkelstein, Rabbi Joel Finkelstein from Memphis, Tennessee, will be giving our shiur. Will be 8:30 Eastern, 7:30 Central Time, I guess. Okay, everybody, Laila Tov, Shabbat Shalom. Nice to see everybody, and we look forward to learning with you. And please invite a friend. And thank you very much. Laila Tov.